Otunkashila wakantanka namako. Te tewa topa onshimaka. Itu hayanke. Oyate oya sinchanko luta oklamani. Oichakya. Oyate oya sin unchi wichala puna oichakya po. Echuichazane washte when you big data. Kichiapi o kianaki. Wakan washete. Ihani lakowe chaki to kashi the kiksuye. Takoyas. All right, let's jump into it, brother.
My friend Four Arrows, thank you for being here. It's an honor and a blessing beyond probably what you will ever know.
Thank you. I'm proud to be here.
I first ran into you in your words in that I believe it was published by Cal Berkeley, that online, what is it, the indigenization controversy, for whom, by whom. And then
right out of UBC's critical journal, yeah. And the reason I wrote that was most of the things I write are a revenge to something or a challenge to something no one else is writing about, right? But that was when Christine Habler came to me as a producer of Indian Horse, with the film that she co-produced with Clint Eastwood. And when the author had died, and she continued the movie, she got complaints from indigenous groups in British Columbia. And even though she was, they did prayers before every scene that was, about the boarding schools, and hired all indigenous peoples. And she really was doing it right. But this is the controversy that article talked about. And I wrote the articles because she had contacted me. I'm heartbroken. I don't know what to do. And I said, well, let's see if we can get an article in your neck of the woods, because she's in, Vancouver, and we'll see if we can deal with that. And so that was the motivation behind it, right? And so it's challenging, and I do make this distinction between place-based indigenous wisdom, which requires fluency in the language, in the ceremonies, and the multi-generational wisdom of the flora and fauna. And we've got to fight for that. That sovereignty is so key for these local areas, and it can be misappropriated. But the worldview and I've been around the world with Kogi Mamos and Kunkak chiefs and Raramori Cimarron people, and as unique and different as their spiritual traditions are, the common themes just stand out, and they stand out in contrast in a non-binary way with the colonial one. So I want to make that distinction, and that worldview belongs to everyone, and that's what we've got to bring back.
Yeah, let's talk about that non-binariness. In the middle of writing a book, and I found myself headlong into the 800-page or 1,000-page, whatever it is, Master and His Emissary by Iain McGilchrist. And I've come to this unbelievable angst. Like, I want to write an entire book, like you're saying, kind of out of this, like, revenge for something that nobody's speaking about, obviously for a different reason, but just this idea of this two-sided brain. And he writes that, like, there's just, I guess I want to kind of start here, and we'll see where it emerges. But like in the book, he's writing about, and I'm not a neuroscientist, and I'll let you speak to those things. You're obviously much more learned, and you've felt that space for so many more years than I have. So for now, I'm just going to accept that there is maybe two sides of the brain, although a lot of his experiences are in the separation. I forget what it's called, but the forced separation of the two sides of the brain. And he claims that the people still live and act and can still function, which is weird to me. How we can separate the relationship between ourselves and what is ourselves, and we can still function. That just seems scientifically weird to me. Anyways, the point is, he writes about what he calls primitive art, and how primitive art is the domination or the mastery of the left hemisphere of the brain, which is control and domination and lacking relationship and place-based visions, right? Now, he's not going to say place-based wisdom, but like these understandings of the world around us don't, as he claims, sit in this left side. And he says that's primitive art. And then he says the opposite of this is Greek art, which is balance, right? And here you see the rise of civilization. And so I want to set this as a foundation, because really what I want to learn from you and sitting with you is so much one of the dominant worldview today is binary. Right? We have two sides of our brain. We have life, that is what we have, and then we have nature, which is something else, non-intelligent, non-living, right? We have this separation. Iain McGilchrist even claims that we can't be one until we are separate. Like our separateness defines our ability to then rejoin as one, which is also something strange to me.
So it sounds like you're critical of Iain McGilchrist's masterpiece, right?
Critical is a light word for it. But I don't want to show my hand, because I don't know what you think.
Well,
and I want to let you lead this.
You showed your hand.
Okay.
And so I want to assume that you haven't read my critiques of that book then.
No. How do I find this?
I'll dig them up for you. Most of them are I just one of I was I'm an enemy sort of the American Psychological Association's history of sterilizing indigenous women and covering up, even in recent times, the Abu Ghraib tortures and stuff like that. So I've refused to use APA, in a lot of books and stuff like that. And then I get an invitation from one of the premier peer-reviewed journals of APA to write an article on decolonizing Western psychology. And the editor is an independent, amazing guy. And I said, well, wait a minute. Now, I don't want to write this for a lot of reasons, but if I do write it, I'm not going to pull any punches. And he said, that's what, what Wade Pickering is his name. He said, no, that's why I don't want you to pull punches. You got to say it like it is. And I said, well, then how's it going to get published? I don't want to spend all this time writing such a long article, peer reviewed with citations, if it's not going to get published. And it won't be if a peer reviewed typical people. He says, what if we use indigenous peer reviewers? I said, you can do that? He said, yeah. Anyway, long story short, I'll send it to you.
Please.
I'll send you a free copy. Don't pass it around. But in it, I must have had 5 pages of my critique of Iain and his work. And he recommended we can't spend too much time on that, so we cut it down to a couple of, I think, 5 paragraphs or something. But here's the deal. Look, bless his heart on the brain hemisphere lateralization. It's interesting. I think there's things to it that are true and important, maybe. But Greg Kaheti and I wrote a book called Critical Neurophilosophy and Indigenous Wisdom. And the original title of that was going to be Neuroscience and Indigenous Wisdom, because everybody was gaga over neuroscience. And if something, there was one study that was done, I can't remember who did it, some university, where they had a page of kind of bullshit and would have people ask, is this true or not? And 70% would say, no, it's not true, until they put an image of a brain with light up things in it and stuff, right? To associate this neuroscience phenomenon. Only 20% found things wrong with it, right? That's how powerful. So Greg and I said, let's sell these attributes of traditional pre-colonial indigenous wisdom: generosity, humility, honesty, courage, these things, and show how we'll get our neuroscientists from my university who are getting their degree in neuropsychology. We'll get them to look at state-of-the-art documents and studies, and then we'll talk about how that they prove indigenous worldviews importance. Well, we get the documents back, And there were things like a laboratory experiment and playing Monopoly, where if you were tapped on the shoulder, you'd give your Monopoly money to somebody. And then your brain was all wired up to see what that act of generosity, even if questionable generosity. But what they concluded even from that was because one little place in the brain lit up that happened to be the same place where a selfishness experiment showed it lit up. So they write this peer-reviewed article saying there's no such thing as altruistic generosity. All acts of generosity are ultimately about selfish getting something back. And it went on and on. Same thing with honesty. Tom Cooper wrote a book called A Time Before Deception. And, we the Lakota used to do ceremonies of healing when treaties were first broke because we thought it was a mental illness, right? And so here's this other study showing that no, deception is an important human survival mechanism, right? So Greg and I said, what are we going to do? And we decided, let's just change the name. So we coined the term critical neurophilosophy, right? All right. So you can see how that ties into Iain's work.
Right.
What he did to me was really tragic because in real life, he, in one of his podcasts, did refer to it, the indigenous culture, as having been immune to the problems that he rightfully was describing, of what's happening in our world. That's the good part of the book, right? But 2,500 pages of not acknowledging 99% of human history, all these pages, and in my critiques, I've referenced his sources. His sources were a book on the American founders who talked about this one reference he does to a Iroquois twins here story, which he misrepresents. If he had studied and realized that the twin hero stories are the ultimate description of this non-binary worldview. They're the ultimate description because no matter how different the two are, and they're always, whether it's a boy, girl, boy, girl, girl, no matter how different, no matter how much they even argue, complementarity is the ultimate. I often give the story of the Navajo, the story where the two come to the father. And Monster Slayer is the solar twin. Child born of the water is the lunar twin. And that's the representation in all of these. It's solar lunar. It's rarely masculine and feminine. And the goal was for the two to become four, the solar and lunar in both. And so the monsters, of course, are those things that humans have a potential for: jealousy, greed, etc. Right? Now, you can't romanticize it in indigenous peoples because they knew that this was a potential for all of them. And their origin stories say so. The origin stories are all about the horrible things that we do. Yeah, but they're told to say, we've got to remember the teachings of the animals and the trees and the mountains. And they did it. We did that without, polluting water. I mean, what was a study in the Amazon rain basins of 13,000 years? Tremendous impact of humans. We have impact just like the Beatles, right? But no negative pollution of air or water. We created Black Earth. And so this twin idea is very complex and very difficult to understand. And I'm so happy you brought it up and showed how McGilchrist totally doesn't get it. And it, even my very pro-indigenous liberal friends, when they see my worldview chart, they see it. Oh, this is a rigid binary for us. You can't do that, right? Well, things are binary. We do have cold and hot and in and out, and this is how humans see the world. But the non-binary, and Western psychologists like Carl Jung have also talked about this union of opposites. But probably Hilary Webb's dissertation does the best on the Andean concept of the Anatan. But in essence, what it means is that ultimately life is symbiotic. Even Darwin said this and when he talked about his theory of evolution, he said, look, this is a long-term process of adaptation that I'm going to talk about. And it in no way changes the fact that the earth is based on mutual aid. And then Peter Kropotkin, I never can pronounce that right, wrote a book called Mutual Aid right at the same time, saying that all these neo-Darwinists who are looking at survival of the fittest and dog eat dog and all of that are totally not getting it. So how do we do this? We can talk about, but it means that I'll give you one example on the worldview chart. The dominant manifestation in our education, our religions, our cultures, our economics is a low respect for women. Okay, that doesn't mean everybody has it, but the worldview chart is contrasting worldview, moral precepts that generally manifest themselves in the culture. And so low respect for women is pretty acknowledged in the research that's pretty much defining the Western Eurocentric worldview. High respect for women, matriarchies, are generally assigned to our indigenous traditional cultures. Well, someone can look at that and go, well, yeah, I'm talking about a liberal person who's really on the side of indigeneity. How can you even consider a low respect for women as being possibly binary, possibly non-binary, possibly interrelated somehow? Well, you can't have a mountain without a valley. So even just looking at studying and understanding the concept of a low respect for women, knowing where it is, empowers you to do the high respect, right? So, but that's an extreme example. Most of them, like, let's take hierarchy. Indigenous cultures manifest a almost non-hierarchical system, except during buffalo hunts. The Lakota, which are matriarchal, non-hierarchical, when the buffalo hunt comes, they become hierarchical, and they say this is the leader. He's the top guy, and he's going to and then they choose a different leader the next hunt or whatever, and it changes again, right? So some of these are more like a continuum, right? And we have the foot in both of them, and we've got to understand the balance point. So it's complex and it's just brilliant that you opened our conversation up with that, because it's sort of a fundamental piece of it. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, it seems interesting to me that a lot of McGilchrist's thoughts, and I've, in the writing of my own book here, I've been able to dive into a lot of his podcasts and speeches and such, and I just have this overwhelming angst, which is why I wanted to bring it up, because to me, what the message that he's getting at is, we are not at war with something deep. Rather, it is the mastery of our left hemisphere over our right. That's what we need to consider. It's not a problem of civilization. It's not a problem about, the genocide, the colonization, the termination of an indigenous worldview 10,000 years ago till today. We don't have to look at ourselves. We don't have to actually truly start asking these deeper questions. Rather, we just have to start letting our right brain dominate. Like, that's the solution. And so it's off-putting or othering, right? Putting this other idea over there and calling it another that we don't have to consider. The role of place-based wisdom and the role of indigenous worldviews and everything else, and focusing on something that is like easily controllable.
It's just the language is just the exact opposite, the mastery. Right. I can share with you one doctoral dissertation that doesn't give a conclusive response to this, but I have to share it with you. It was a long time ago, and maybe 10, 15 years ago. And it was a South Korean student who had access to MRI machines in South Korea because her uncle was a neuroscientist. And so she wanted to do a Svara yoga thing about nostril breathing, and had the theory that the right brain hemisphere correlated with the left nostril dominance, etc., and the opposite. And that if someone was stressed, something would happen that was out of balance, and if someone was unstressed, something would happen that was in balance with both nostrils having the same freedom of breath. And so what she did is she created a little film called Simple Sounds and Sights of Nature. Little brook and tree and little rabbits and stuff like that. And then she had a segment of Al Gore's film, An Inconvenient Truth, where they pulled the ice core out and it showed we're in bad shape. This is scary. And in the machine, she had buttons where if your right nostril is dominant, you pressed one button and vice versa, based on watching each of the films. And so, when it was all over with, it turned out that her theory had been right, or the ancient Svara yoga theory had been right. But what blew the minds of everybody, except kind of her and I, kind of slapped hands, right? All the neuroscientists, they're looking at it and they're going, wow, was when they watched the scary film of the ice core, both parts, the corpus callosum was pretty blacked out that joins the hemispheres, and the two hemispheres had little places of light where the pituitary gland kind of lit up. Different places were lighting up on both sides of the brain, showing stress, but on both sides. Then when they were really calm and they were watching this beautiful little film, what happened was both sides of the brain completely black, no activity. But the corpus callosum was lit up like the Golden Gate Bridge. And I just kind of want to tie that to, I didn't really tie that to McGilchrist until this moment, right? But I mean, it kind of totally blows his thing out of the water. It shows that these two agencies are working in a complementary way, that ultimately the bottom line is in the bridge between them. I mean, so I wish that particular study would be replicated or whatever.
Right.
And I think it's
right.
Kind of a sidebar on that is I participated as a subject also, as also the chair of the committee. And when I got out, the scientists were looking at my brain waves, and they were like going, in their language, they were like shocked. And I thought, oh shit, I got a brain tumor or something. I was about 65 at the time. And so I called over the Zhang Ming, who was our actually a third co-author of the book. I should have mentioned him, but I said, "What's going on here?" And he went and talked to them, and it turned out what it is as you get older, those worms that we of gray matter, it's separated more and more and more and more. So you can tell someone's age by how tight they are. A young person, they're very tight. So apparently mine were as tight as a 40-year-old. And the reason for that is that the more thinking you do, the more creative you are, that kind of stuff, the less that space goes. That's just a sidebar.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Yeah, well, it's just, in your book, which I have here, and I don't want to let another minute go by without telling, this is one of my favorite books of all time. It truly is Restoring the Kinship Worldview, that you co-authored. I think it came out 3 years ago. Yeah. And oh my gosh, like a word for me is not entirely important, but it is truly an amazing book. But in the beginning of the book, you talk about worldview, and we've used this term enough. Obviously, the book is about the indigenous worldview. In the many, I think you lay out 28 indigenous precepts in the copy. But in the intro, we dive into this understanding what a worldview is historically, and you talk about Immanuel Kant. You bring up Heidegger. I think you mentioned that he says it's world intuition, and then you quickly redefine it to like a world sense. Quickly, let's unpack this idea of worldview, because we've been using it, and then get into how this affects this understanding of this non-binary world.
Yeah, in my maybe 2008 book it was, Unlearning the Language of Conquest, University of Texas published, I had a chapter of I had Vine Deloria Jr. and a whole number of people submit chapters. It was his last chapter, by the way. Wow. And I had a guy, I said, you know what? I hate the word worldview. Would you end this by saying that my use of this throughout the book is, deserves skepticism? So he did, and he did a good job of it. Because indigeneity is really about beingness in the world. Right. And this idea, this Eurocentric idea of seeingness is in itself colonial, and yet I stick, and Darsh and I, when I told her about this story, when I invited her to co-author the book with me, that you just referred to, we came up with existence-scape, which we borrowed from somebody. We came up with cosmovision. None of them really worked because the literature has grown so much since Weltanschauung and the German, people that brought that forth. It really has. And then Robert Redfield, and in his work, saying there's really only two worldviews. If you look at conversations that really, really go deeply, they always talk about, nature-based versus, human-centered, materialism versus spiritual, and they come up with, and he says there's really essentially two. And he said the greatest tragedy of human history was the overshadowing of what he calls the metropolitan worldview, which I'm calling the dominant Western Eurocentric one. That overshadowing of what he called the primal one is the greatest tragedy in human history. And this is out of the University of Chicago, and he's considered the father of social anthropology. And I really, that's my shtick, that cultures, philosophies, and religions can all be placed under one of these two worldviews. And I've shown that in my research, right? So the idea of worldview is not the best word, but it has gotten to be understood more or less as the relationship of humans to humans, humans to other forms of nature, and humans to the sense of what happens when we die, right? And then the moral precepts that those understandings bring forth are the basic kinds of easy to understand ways of being that our worldview chart does. We just got a grant for the Veterans for Peace. I'll announce it here. The first organization, I think, in the world to do this. 2 years ago, I keynoted the Veterans for Peace. I founded Chapter 108 and talked about worldview. And they really got it. And most of them are kind of old white guys, right? But they got it because of where they've been and where they're going and want to go. So now I've been invited to come back again, but this time with a grant that we got for them, where they're going to look at the worldview chart. And now we've got it up to 50 precepts. Darsh and I added 10 to the ones that I originally did in the Red Road, Champkulu. And they're going to study them for like 10 minutes a day. That's all. And they're going to see, where am I? And with the problems I'm having with my chapter meetings, with our goals of bringing peace into the world, or with my own personal lack of peace or with peace in the world, where am I out of balance at in this continuum between the dominant and the indigenous? And just with 10 minutes a day, we're asking them to do this. And then at meetings, we're asking them to start out with having it in a poster on the wall, which people can get from Kindred Media. And let's see if anything happens, right? And the reason that I wanted to do this, and it starts in about a month, is a couple of my doctoral students have done similar things. One of them was a director of an institute where people were working, adult people were working with adult mentally ill people, and were suffering from compassion fatigue, and diagnosed with it and burning out. He did a similar thing with worldview reflection and practice and using trance-based learning to make the changes, which is what ceremony is. We've known that for 99% of human history. And by golly, he's got statistically significant with his psychometric reductions in compassion fatigue just by looking at these fundamental beliefs that guide us in the world. And so that's why I think, UC Berkeley, I think their Science Center for the Greater Good selected that book you're talking about as one of the most thought-provoking, inspiring, and practical science books of 2022. And I hadn't thought of it as science, but it is, and worldview science, I think, is starting to really emerge. Some top people have said it's probably the most important thing we're not looking at.
Mm. Science, I think today it's being prostrated before us as this savior to what we popularly call the meta-crisis, which is a term McGilchrist uses quite often. I'm not saying it's a bad term. What I'm saying is a connecting term between the conversations and the threads that we've been enjoying here. I wanted to ask you, about a year ago, I reached out to you because I was in the middle of writing another book, and I was coming to the conclusion that we can't save the world. And I wasn't okay with my conclusion, that it maybe is too late, that civilization is run amok, and trying to engineer new stories, new creative solutions, new energies, new technologies to save the world that we perceive to be around us, which often feels increasingly like a fake world that we have constructed. And I think you and I would agree on that. It's disheartening. And you said something to me that changed my life, and we don't have to repeat it here. But I want to start unpacking this side of the conversation, because if there's only two worldviews, and I agree with you, and let's just take that as the foundation to the question, that the first worldview is that humanity and nature are one and cannot be separated, and that it is intelligent and wonderful. And the second worldview is that humanity and nature are not one, and that we are separated, and that we are animate and intelligent, and nature that's around us, the tree outside of my window or whatever it is not animate and not intelligent. What do you think about the arguments and energies around solving this quote-unquote meta-crisis that we live in today? Are they a waste of time? Do they have good energies to them? What is the role that either indigenous worldview, as we've discussed here, or even place-based knowledge and indigenous ancestral wisdom can play in regard to our understanding of our current moment?
Wow, that is a powerful question.
It's a big one. Sorry.
It's a big one. And I think my answer is going to maybe be a disappointment to some of your listeners. It was when right before the COVID hit, I was presenting at the University of British Columbia's College of Education. And at the end, they asked me a similar question. They said, so do you think we can turn things around if we, and this might have been, I think, what we talked about, but
it is.
Do you think we can turn around things? And it just came out of me. And as I think I told you, they went from loving me to hating me in that second. And their hands went up. Well, why are you here? Your book profits go to indigenous causes. Why are you writing books? You're traveling. Well, I said, I'm going to quote Sitting Bull. And Sitting Bull was asked a similar question by a reporter when he was in prison and just before he died. Why have you been so full of life and generosity and writing your songs and singing your songs and doing sun dances right up until you got caught or whatever. And your art. And when smallpox has wiped everybody in your culture out and the buffalo are all gone and, all the horrible things.
Right.
And he said, because I'm still a human being. And really, I think what he meant by that was that we are creatures of this planet. I have to admit that I wrongly saw humans as a cancer to the planet maybe 30 years ago. I'm so sorry for that, because we are children of Mother Earth, just like the ants and just like the trees and the walruses. And so I take that back, but if we are human beings that are a species that is part of this symbiosis that we talked about earlier, then that's our mission. And if we understand the indigenous understanding of a human being is that we are spiritual entities in a container that we call a body that we have chosen. And, and now, I don't want to get new agey on this, and we don't understand the details of something called reincarnation. But the University of Virginia's perceptual studies program was touted as being by a Nobel Peace Prize winner in quantum physics. I can't remember his name, but he said their research on after-death experiences is as good as anything in quantum physics. And of course, they say in their science that there's something that happens, that it's the best explanation. That reincarnation is the best possible explanation, right? A study came out of British Columbia called Amerindian rebirthing, and it talked about, unlike the Eastern ideas about reincarnation, there was something like 40% of the people that had seemed to have bona fide reincarnation stories, that the reincarnations could be or were other than humans. And animals and even trees, right? Cedar trees. So who knows how it works? But this idea of recycling, and making decisions and being a spirit is in all of the diverse indigenous culture. And probably most of the Western ones have some part of it. I think it was taken out of Christianity in Constantinople because it didn't have political clout that the one life, one God had. So to your question, if we are spirits, we're probably coming back to deal with whatever horrors are happening or are going to happen. And if we really understand that we are human beings that are like other creatures, spiritual entities, we're all in this together and will continue. Energy doesn't die. Energy continues.
Right.
And if the many, 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 many traditional stories of our ancestors all kind of point to this, whatever the differences are minor. We go up to the Milky Way and we decide where we're going to go. Do we go to another planet? Do we go into the cosmos? Do we come back to this amazing gift that is Mother Earth? And all of these kinds of things, we can't prove any better than the Institute at the University of Virginia, I guess, but it doesn't matter. If we can think of that as being a human being, then even if, and it's possible we could turn things around, it's just not likely based on what we're seeing until great calamity comes, even greater. But the kinds of calamities being represented in Gaza today, right? And it's a forewarning, and yet we look at what we can't even agree with the World Court on its. I'm talking about we, the United States of America, right, and its allies. You see all these congressmen standing up and clapping to Netanyahu's lies, and 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 I was there in 1999, and so I saw Gaza. I saw the horrors of on both sides, but especially the rationale for the suicide bombings in Gaza, and so people that say this started on October 7th, right? We're like watching Columbus and his annihilation of the Taino people on Democracy Now! Okay, that's what's happening, right? And so how can we look at the reactions to that, the continuation of that, the continuation of the war against nature, the infamous 900-page book, the 2025, and what it's talking about? They've already gotten, under Trump's previous administration, they already got the Endangered Species Act gutted, and it's getting worse, right? Even under Biden, right? And so, wow, it's hard to be optimistic that any of the stuff that we're doing is gonna work to stop things. I think what I might have shared with you is a new definition of hope, and that is, hope is not a fair or high certainty or expectation that things are going to turn out all right. It's the certainty that what you're doing is the right thing to do, regardless of the outcome. And I think that brings us to this one of the worldview precepts about a fear-based culture, which is the Western dominant worldview, is based on that, and a courage to fearlessness based. This idea of fearlessness has been put down by Western philosophers, including Socrates. I think Gandhi was the only one who said fearlessness is a good thing. And but I've seen it in indigenous cultures around the world, and in my studies of traditional indigenous cultures that are still, against all odds, holding on to it. And so moving from courage to fearlessness, I think, is the answer to the problem you're putting forth, of the pain of wow, why are we doing this? And the fearlessness can be defined as a deep trust in the universe and in these things we've been talking about, in spirit and body. And so I sometimes I describe this as, if I'm going to get you to come to here, and right now I'm on Vancouver Island on Tokwa Indian land, and about 2 miles down the road is this stairway to heaven, a big log with stairs on it that goes to a waterfall. And I'd bring, I'd say, come on, Firth, let's go upstairs and climb up this place where the bears climb and grab salmon, and we'll be like a bear, and we'll go up there, and then we'll jump into the water. I've already checked it out. It's still deep. There's no logs in it. It's safe. It's about 30 feet. Well, most of us kind of go, whoa, it's kind of be afraid to jump off of something like that. But we can get the courage pretty easily, people like us. And so we get the courage. Well, that's an emotion. It takes some stress to have courage. And you jump and you go, you hit the water. You get out. You go, I did it. You want to do it again? No, that was good. Now, indigenous people understand how to move, and a number of people have learned this, I know, that are not indigenous, to move from courage to fearlessness. So now I say, come on, let's go back up again. This time you're going to do it by moving into fearlessness. You say, okay, I trust you. We'll do it. Now you go up, and I kind of say, do some self-hypnosis. Use this natural trance movement. And I want you just to really imagine, first of all, how safe it is. You already did it and proved that. Now I want you to imagine how beautiful it was and how you might have missed some of the beauty. And I really want you to go into this idea that no matter what, when your feet leave the ledge, right, then there's no need for anything but knowing you're doing the right thing, right? Well, now you go and you take a breath, you kind of imagine this, you trust the universe, and you leap. It's a different experience. Now it's almost like slow motion. You see an eagle flying overhead. As you're going down, you see a salmon go up towards the waterfall. You feel the air. When your feet first touch, you notice it, and the bubbles of the water coming up that you just are amazed by, and that's how I've experienced the Kogi Mamos when I was with them. That's how I experienced the Murray Cimarron people when I was with them. That's how I experienced the pockets of Lakota Sundancers who have hit bottom and have come back up and are back to who their culture once was. That's what you see. You see this sense of fearlessness, this sense of humor and joyfulness and generosity, and it's like, it took me a near-death experience to realize it, but we don't have to do that. Just study the worldview chart and start practicing it, and use the chance-based learning, and we can at least, and this will be the last part of my answer to your question, we can at least be ready to rebuild when we come back. Or if we decide to continue on somewhere else, we can hope that the vibrations of the podcasts that you do, of the books that you write, and many of our other colleagues that are working in this direction, that those will be the things that guide whoever rebuilds, and not what you see in the post-apocalyptic movies. There's another guy with a machine gun and dragging a woman by the head, right? And so, to me, that's worth keeping up this work.
Yeah, it's that redefinition of hope, like you were saying. It impacted me more than I think you'll ever know. I mean, it is really the foundation of my latest book, Stag Time, which I should send you a copy of.
Yes, tell me the name again.
Stag Time.
Stag Time. Oh,
Stag Time. Yeah, we can talk about it later, of course. It's just, we are surrounded by, you and I, this idea that we are, I see this quite often. I see this in a lot of writings that I, unfortunately, have surrounding me, that we are a culture in between two stories. We see these ideas that we need a news story. We need to create these new stories. We need to start telling a new story. And I think some of the people arguing for this would agree with you and myself. But I think a lot of it is still casting, how do you want to say? They have deep trust in the fact that through courageous action, we can erect a new edifice for humanity. Which is the opposite of what you're saying.
Yeah. Let me jump in on that, because, I'm bumping into that all the time with dear colleagues who really keep talking about, we've got to come up with a new way.
Right.
Now, it's understandable that people are saying that if you look at what's the tragedy in so many indigenous cultures with alcoholism and domestic violence and all that, right? But if you look at our website, Proven Sustainable, we just got actually a trademark for that, provensustainable.org. We're showing existing cultures that are doing this, that are because of their indigenous worldview. If your reader goes to and puts in the media missed a message, The Nation, maybe add 4 arrows to it, but it'll come up right away. My article in The Nation is about the largest study ever done on biodiversity in 2019 that showed, and they used the word indigenous worldview. I mean, that was used.
Wow.
It blew my mind. They say where indigenous worldview was operating and allowed to have some control of the land, the extinction rate that we have just cited, which was frightening, was non-existent or severely reduced. And this is mentioned 7 times in this, this was like 50 countries, 450 interdisciplinary research scientists, 15,000 peer-reviewed papers, and they came up with this conclusion. And I wanted to get it into popular magazine. So I went to the oldest one and the liberal one in the United States, and they published it, and they named it. They called it "The Media Missed an Important Message in the UN Biodiversity Report." That's the name of it, right? And so, I mean, we've got this evidence. We've got this evidence of it being proven sustainable. So why would we look for something new? This is I think what just, now, don't get me wrong. It's always getting newer. I mean, things change. We change.
Right.
Indigenous worldview is got its basic understanding, but the operations of it, have progressed, in ways. I'm not saying that there isn't going to be a new. Let's not even use the word new, because I think that's the problem.
Yes, exactly.
There's going to be some modifications from what we learn each day. We can then make better what it is that we're doing, but we'll still hold on to the fundamental worldview that we are all related, that nature is the laws of nature over the laws of humans, or that in other words. So we've got to come up with, maybe a modified word or a adapting to the current situation or whatever. But this whole idea, I keep seeing it over and over again, of philosophers and authors coming up. Here is a new paradigm. We've got to seek a new paradigm for the future. Why? When we have a truly proven, sustainable, and proven, and this is not romanticizing. We've already covered that.
Right.
The evidence is just clear on so many levels that the health profile, if you take away, early childhood deaths, if you look at people that came over here and warred against indigenous people, they learned about that, and they went AWOL when they had serious health issues to go live with the indigenous peoples, right? Happiness. I've seen that in contemporary cultures, even that are suffering through so much, the way that they can manifest this sense of community, and those that are still using the old ways, and happiness. And this has been validated in so many studies. Now, is it controversial? Yeah. Levitt's work back in 1977 and the Yale archives essentially say that around 80%, I think he said 77, around 80% of all pre-Columbian, contact tribes of the Americas meet the criteria of being a peaceful society. It doesn't mean that there weren't these, the anger or killings or whatever, but that the definitions of the research on peaceful societies are very clear about that. Those are allowed for, right? But that not like a war society, and the ones that were not, there were reasons for it. They were patriarchal. They had serious problems that the patriarchy took advantage of in ways or something. There's a whole way of just, scholarship on that. But essentially, the research is strong on that. There's even a book out called The New Dawn of Everything, where they show that the Enlightenment of people that we love, like Henry David Thoreau, right? That all came from indigenous voices who were slaves in Great Britain, who then were allowed to go and give presentations and at group meetings, who were saying the horrible things about all the rats and the lack of sanitation and the inequities, and we know now that Thoreau had over 1,000 pages of notes of his local indigenous peoples, right? And so the Enlightenment is, but we just have such a hard time because of our propaganda, our anti-Indianism, our belief that only humans have intrinsic value, which my co-author in the book differing worldviews. Walter Block, who I invited to write because he disagreed with I disagreed with everything he'd written. He believes that, and only humans have intrinsic value. Everything else on earth is utilitarian. And so we're trying to find something new, but, I don't know why.
Yeah. Well, no, you bring up this idea of, anthropology and the history and the noble savage, that terminology that we use here in modern history about this like pristine otherness of the indigenous person pre-Columbian contact here in the Western Hemisphere, Turtle Island. And I think it's just too simple. Like, I love what you said earlier. I mean, I don't think this. Many people think this, and I think you've well demonstrated it during our time together. But we want, this. You said the word see-ness as opposed to be-ness, or seeing-ness as opposed to being-ness. These two worldviews. Summarize them down to that. So much of our culture's mythology, regardless if it's the Judeo-Christian, Old Testament or creation mythology, to pick your poison. So much of that is about seeingness. It's about separation. It's about otherness. Now, there's nuance there, of course, but we birthed out of this worldview of seeingness in the modern era of the meta-crisis, of the world in ruins, at the world on the edge. We want to see our way through to a solution. Being seems way too simple for us. Like that's what the noble savage did. Somebody that we can respect, but somebody who exists outside of civilized history. And so it seems like we're replaying this noble savage, this ratio, what do they call it? Ratio ecology. There's a term. There was an anthropologist in the late 19th century, Matt, I could look it up. I should have this more into the forefront of my memory. But he was looking at that skulls, and he found that the Caucasian supposedly white human being had a very round skull, a perfect skull, a thinking skull. And he equated the idea of brain size to intelligence, right? And then obviously using the Judeo-Christian mythology of creation, that out of, Adam and Eve came everyone else, that, everything else was a degeneration of that skull. Indigenous peoples, Black Africans, etc. And that's the beginning of this, ology, this scientificism, around race. I mean, Find Deloria speaks about this.
Yeah.
Excessively, Custer died for your sins. I could keep going, Yeah, but it just seems like we're replaying that narrative.
Yeah, and that phrenology thing, and it was historically, as medical science was continuing to promote a Eurocentric way, and that was another way of putting down people of color, etc. But another foundation to this knowingness that you're talking about, that you just it's a beingness, it's just knowingness, is the unfortunate way that Maslow created his hierarchy of needs. I mean, that is fundamental. From Kohlberg developmental models and all that really are essentially based on Maslow's incorrect and known incorrect approach to understanding this knowingness, this idea of self-actualization being natural. And yet he wrote about it, about the truthful version of it. I don't know if your readers know about, the Blackfoot, but he went to, in 1936, during right at the end of his doctoral dissertation, he went to further prove that 80% or more of people are not self-actualized, and which was at this little. Remember, there was a triangle that he didn't he didn't create the triangle, but that's how people represented it. And at the very top was self-actualization, and you had at the bottom all the things that you need from shelter and love and belongingness and all that stuff. And that very few people get through that to self-determination up into self-actualization.
Right.
And he thought, well, that surely will be the case on these poor savages on the Blackfoot Reservation, right?
Right.
But he was blown away at the opposite. He was blown away that these people, the 80%, was the ones that were self-actualized. It was just the opposite. And he wrote about this, referring to something, I think he used the word bastards of the people that were his crowd compared to these people. But he did not publish it. He did not make it what it was, because he knew he'd be laughed out of the academy if he was saying that these savages were superior in their life ways. And what a tragedy that was. How different things would have been if Maslow would have created a true, which now people are writing about it, they're putting the pyramid upside down, and that when a baby is born and they look at it, they see a self-actualized being. And then so in the new pyramid, they have that the whole bottom is self-actualization, and then the thing, there's only two things on top of it, and that relates to the community being able to promulgate and continue that into perpetuity, right? How different it would have been had we, but these kind of fundamental psychological ideas and philosophical and educational ideas continue this anthropocentric, human-centered, anti-nature in a way. I mean, you can't even look up the word nature in a dictionary and not find definitions all over the place, including Oxford. Everything but humans and what humans make. How far can we get, right? From
right. Which I mean, it does shine a lot of light into the narrative of, the save the world, meta crisis, techno-social collapse. I mean, like, all of our attempts to maintain the world as is, from regenerative agriculture to, the meta crisis and, AI and everything in between, is we have to assert more control over those things that surround us, or that, our lives surround is probably more accurate. 94% of all mass on Earth is, from an animal perspective, is domesticated humans and our domesticated animals. And so, we kind of surround the rest of it. But if everything else is inanimate, if everything else is unintelligent, but all of us are in trouble, then it's up to humanity to rise up, to control our way to saving the day, right? And so it's not a trust in the environment. Like, I'm thinking still back to your courage versus fearlessness. We feel a sense of courageousness because we feel a sense of dominance. But fearlessness to me is the opposite. Yeah.
Yeah, I think our competitive sports represent that. In competitive sports, it's so beautiful to see how indigenous traditions have operated. I mean, stories like two groups will form a team of 10 people, and then they go out and get a dead log, and then they have to go over mountains and for 50 kilometers, and
wow.
To really push themselves. Well, then one team starts to get ahead, and people are even betting on it sometimes, right? That are involved with it just to see which team will happen to come across first. Well, what happens on the trail is, as soon as the one with the lighter log gets too far ahead, people drop off of it and go back and help the guys with the heavier log, right? That's that kind of thing. I mean, at Carlisle, the coaches, were unbelievably angry about how the football teams, Jim Thorpe being one of the great players, kept tying with West Point and some of those Eastern schools back in the days, right? And they couldn't understand why they kept tying, right? Because they were so much better. well, is that people kind of backed off just enough, to keep it going, right? Competition was always seen as an opportunity to push one another to your highest potential, right? Mm. I watched a Wahinkpe run with the Raramuri in a very remote place, that 3-day hike into. You can go on YouTube now, and I put the remnants of my photos on it. It's called The Shaman's Message, and see, the 2 trips into Copper Canyon. But the run was, they start by each family making this wooden ball out of oak. And then with the instep, it's kicked up and down this 8,000-foot canyon, but on the top levels of it. But it falls sometimes 1,000 feet down, and it's an amazing thing. They wear deer antlers to keep from falling asleep. The race lasts sometimes 20, 22 hours, and so everybody came from around 100 miles to this flat plain area over the top of the canyon, and everybody was drinking corned beer and passing and things around that they had made, and gambling, on who would come first. And the first team comes across, and there was absolutely nothing except exchanging of stuff, and the athletes went to their wives and got massaged and food and water, and and so I stupidly, this is a long time ago, I stupidly asked my translator to ask Agustin Ramos, the medicine man I was with, why are this was like an Olympic event, why are the athletes not being praised for winning and being, put up on the shoulders of people and getting awards? And I'm so embarrassed that I'm admitting I asked that question. And he talked for, I think, 5 minutes. And I could tell by his expression that he knew this was definitely a white guy question. And then the answer that my translator gave back was, he said, well, somebody had to come across first. That was all he said, right? So, but this idea of competition in our world, whether it be capitalism or sports, has the same fiendish, unfortunate kind of way of being. I was a sports psychologist for a long time, and I quit because I saw people that would win gold medals fall apart psychologically after that because that was all their dad said was important, and now it didn't seem so important, and that kind of stuff, right? And so that's another concept that is in our worldview precepts about competition, to feel superior versus competition to increase your full potential. And so if we could just get back to these basic worldview precepts and start to say, oh, okay, that makes sense. Now let me use some trance-based learning and to visualize doing it, and let me then take action and actually do it, and bingo. And I'm getting letters all the time of people that are starting to do this, and it's transformative, Wow. And I've got like at least 3 doctoral students at Antioch that I just went to. I'm working for Antioch now. I left fielding, and it's, I don't know. It's going to be it'll be interesting to see if enough people can do this to rebuild properly.
Yeah. I think the response that you're voicing to the crises that surround us, so much of them call us to go outward, to create new solutions, to create new stories, to erect these new edifices, etc. I think Iain McGilchrist's work has been so powerful to a lot of people because it asks us to come inward, right, into our mind and start seeing how that's balanced. And we're drawn to that. But I think the issue is, as you've well demonstrated here, is it's not a mind's problem to some large degree. Obviously, the body is one, but to isolate the mind above, feel intelligence.
But he's not even talking mind.
That's true.
He's talking 2
hemispheres,
physical organs.
Yeah. Right.
And so so we can look at the really mostly inaccurate ideas about one brain does this and one brain does that, but then when we're doing that, we're starting to get into worldview precepts, if you start, so that's what I think, well, okay, so maybe you're right. Maybe we have lost, some of the strength of one. There could be a lot of truth in that, but to have one be the master is going in the wrong direction, right? And so, but what are you going to do? Go up there and get inside and twist them around and
you seem to be giving voice to this idea, this ancient indigenous idea of worldview being the whole, right? Like the heart matters, the feelings matter, your ancestors, your legacy matters, your DNA, like all of these things matter because it's just one essence. Like you're saying, we're the spirit, this energy, this vibration inside this clay form that is potentially reborn or moves on or extends outward in the atmosphere into the cosmos, whatever that is, whatever that looks like. But yes, it is a return back into oneself, but to the all of oneself.
That's right.
Right.
Your consciousness is as much outside of us as it is inside of us, right?
Yeah.
It's in the, just go out and be with a tree in the wilderness for a while.
A dear friend of mine is a Maori, the healer herbalist of the Waitaha Nation in northern New Zealand, I believe, is where her father's people are from. And she's coming to the States here for a little bit of a journey in her own way. But she's stopping here at our land here. And we're going to do a 4-day, I think it's going to be a 4-day, what she calls tree festival, which is this ceremony, this experience of getting into the natural world and having a confrontation with boredom and oneness and togetherness and communication with, as she would say, our relations, our cousins. And it's hard for people. Like you're saying, coming inward to some degree is easy. Allowing that inward understanding to enter the oneness that surrounds us is a huge step for many people. But as you write, a needed step.
That's right. And, and talking about New Zealand, I mean, it's tragic what's happening right now.
Yeah.
And, because the new right-wing movements that are happening all over the world, not just in the United States with Trumpism, are starting to say, that even though the Maori still suffer more than the non-indigenous people, like in most places, they were so far advanced, with bringing language into schools and stuff like that. And now the new right-wing coalitions are trying to put all of that backwards again, and so it's really sad. But
yeah,
this is the pushback that's happening in the world, and I think one way that we can think of it is that during times of stress, all creatures become hypersuggestible to the perceived communication of a trusted authority figure. And I taught hypnosis for MFCC licensure at UC Berkeley, and it was a controversial hypothesis. I learned it from wild horses. If your readers go onto YouTube, just put in the wild horse hypnotist. But the reason that the wild horse can respond is to telepathic communication, which we all used to be able to do, is trust, but that trust has to be earned, and the fear is a survival mechanism that causes the trust to happen in a perceived trusted authority figure. Well, if you think about all of us being in this state of hypnosis where we are afraid because of our jobs, our incomes, climate change, all the things that are causing people to be afraid, if that concept of, during times of stress, people become hypersuggestible to the communication of a perceived trusted authority figure, well, that's why we are falling into the lap of these loud-speaking, dictatorial kinds of individuals who are calling out the sort of the the wishy-washiness of Democrats, right? And the
Right.
back, and this is happening all over the world, right? And I think it's a hypnosis. Dr. Michael Fisher, who wrote a book about fearlessness, it was called Fearless Engagement of Four Arrows. He calls it an intellectual biography of me, Fearless Engagement of Four Arrows. And I think that I have a copy of it handy, but he's got like 150 footnotes or endnotes at the end of each chapter, so it's a very scholarly book. But he refers to the cat-fawn connection, which was a vision that happened to me on a kayaking accident on the Rio Orique River, where I came upon a mountain lion that was in a cave where my partner and I were firefighters at the time. The river was, the whole river disappeared into an underground drainage and took me into it. And then we had to stay in a cave that kept getting higher and higher. We kept getting higher and higher on ledges. Wow. A mountain lion showed us the way out. And that became the CAT, C-A-T, concentration activated transformation, which means self-hypnosis. And then we came upon a Tarahumara who had run down, they're great runners, a baby deer, a fawn, and was carrying it. And so the fawn came to me as F-A-W-N, fear, authority, words, nature. Well, how the dominant worldview deals with worldview precepts that relate to fear, authority, words, and nature are very opposite of our right. Pre-colonial. Fear is in the indigenous way. Once fight or flight is done, and then it becomes an opportunity to practice a virtue like courage or generosity or honesty or humility. Authority is always only your own lived experience and reflection on it. You have respect to listen to elders or medicine people, but they had no authority. Words were sacred vibrations, and it had to be spoken, and it was easier to do in the verb-based languages. With truth, nature was our teacher, right? And so by taking these two things and moving them forward, well, Michael Fisher refers to that cat-fawn process, and of course, in his book on me, as a dehypnotizing technology. And I love that. I love that because I think it's using hypnosis to dehypnotize.
Right.
I don't see how else we can explain what we're doing on Earth of intelligent people, doing what they're doing, standing up and clapping for genocide,
right.
Ignoring the I'd rather pollute the water and make my profit than have clean water. It has to be related to this phenomenon that indigenous cultures always knew existed without knowing the technological ideas or this about brainwave frequency. They knew if they didn't do ceremony, they would not be as optimal, as generous, as good a hunter. Ceremony is a form of hypnosis. If you define hypnosis as believing in an image, remember Einstein said imagination is more powerful than knowledge. Believing in an image when you're in a lower brainwave frequency than we are right now, maybe even just alpha. That's all hypnosis is, because we know that when that happens, the combination of ideomotor neurons and other things that occur, you have a tendency to do this. This is why there hasn't been a gold medalist in the Olympics for 50 years who hasn't had a sports psychologist teaching them how to use visualization or hypnosis, right? And yet, all the Abrahamic religions say it's of the devil. Hollywood bastardizes it, and who controls it? Frank Luntz and people in the right wing that they're doing these repetitive statements, and it's like we've got to re-embrace this understanding and start using it, because it's got to be incorporated into our transformation. We just don't do it often. It only takes a few seconds. You don't have to pay anybody, And if you don't want to, if you don't know how, or if you're in that state to allow for a positive image that's positively phrased, our a book that I wrote on medical emergency hypnosis in 1991, that Prentice Hall published, called Patient Communication for First Responders. It was banned. I was in Brisbane, Australia, and speaking to emergency room physicians about it, and they said, "We can't get your book." Well, some big shot wrote an article for the Journal of Emergency Medical Services saying this should be used only by licensed physicians certified in hypnosis, right?
Wow.
20 years later, this year, one of my doctoral students, who was a 20-year paramedic, and I said, he said, this book's got to be republished. I said, it's yours. So anyway, Routledge of London just republished it. This time it's called Hypnotic Communication in Medical Emergency Settings. And it's got back cover endorsements by two of the most renowned emergency room physicians. And this time, because I had computers, it's got, we have a lot of case studies supporting how you can, as an adjunct to standard medical care, you can get somebody to stop bleeding by saying, when I count to 3, I want you to stop your bleeding, right? So this is the ultimate example. That's during times of stress, your words can cause healing. And so, and the medical emergency is the extreme example of it, right? So another one of those things of indigeneity, this understanding of spirit, this understanding of ceremony, this understanding of being one with all. They're so basic, and we have so hypnotized ourselves away from them.
There's a quote in the intro to your book, Restoring the Kinship Worldview, which I was trying to find by the time you concluded that sentence, but I'm failing. Talking about, so I think the last question I want to get into, which is a derivative of what you're saying here, is so much of either decolonization or indigenization, which I realize are not the same thing, of course, but so much of both of these narratives today have such a prevalence, such an ability to culturally appropriate something that is not healthy in the slightest. Just say it that way. You are obviously a proponent of the indigenous worldview becoming whole and real and living in us modern people, regardless of our ability or our history of holding place-based wisdom, which is why you separate these two things, of course. What is the role of somebody like me, right? An American-born Irishman, in relearning, reawakening, re-inhabiting these ceremonies? There's this place of hypnosis. Fool's medicine crow, fool's crow.
Yeah, fool. That's what fool's crow.
That's the quote that I'm trying to find. Yeah.
Yeah, his famous quote. I can send you the reference. But fool's crow said that people who do not share this medicine don't know the medicine, and he refers, to that. And white standing buffalo is what I did a presentation with Greg Cahetti and Robin Kimmerer, and I had Darsha got a lot of money for us to bring indigenous speakers to University of Notre Dame for a indigenous know-how conference. And after the first day, I think it was Barbara Alice Mann and some of my friends, indigenous women, they said, we can't do this to this white audience. We're giving too much information away. And my heart just sunk. And well, I had brought white standing buffalo, and I had to kind of fight for him because the university would only give money for PhDs. And he doesn't even have a high school degree, but he's a Sundance chief that I have a great respect for. And I just had this intuition. Spirit told me to bring him. Well, it was a good thing I did, because I I would have blown it, like, because I was like, this is why I brought you here. What are you talking about? We got to, but I just said, why standing buffalo? And we were in a circle. Can you speak to that? Oh man. And did he speak to it, for 15 minutes. And, he said the same kind of thing that Fool's Crow was saying. And these wise women who were great indigenous scholars, they said, okay. And then we continued, And so this is tough. And we are divided. Indian country is divided, and you have to appreciate both sides, the misappropriation. And sometimes I say, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe bringing this into education has been the wrong thing, since education itself has been the enemy. And maybe I'm just giving the educational people enough to rationalize that maybe they're doing something good when really they're not even coming close. So I can take either side and argue it well. Okay. However, all you got to do is look at what's happening in Indian country and how it's being lost, and say, well, who's left to teach this? First of all, is one big problem. We can go overseas into places where, 80% of the biodiversity on Mother Earth is on only 20% of the land. Right. We can go to those people, but they're losing it too. I've been there. And so, well, wait a minute. And who could say that a culture or a group of people have the right to claim how the world works? Well, they do have the experience, for those who are using that experience in their traditional place-based language, to say, we know that this is the best science for how the world works because it's proven itself for many, many generations, right? And so, but now they're disappearing all over the world. You can't use a culture in Colombia to come over to a culture in Mexico, because that's then is misappropriation, because the language is different, the ceremonies are different, because the flora and fauna and the wind and the climate are different. And that's the power, right? So what do? Well, there's no option. There's no option but to re-indigenize ourselves as best we can. If we're in a place where there are elders who know, then you have the obligation to call on them and hire them for their work, and to support the sovereignty for anybody else who's trying to get there. But, like I say, 80% of the Navajo aren't there anymore. What are we going to do? We've got to then, well, okay, I live here now. And, and I use, there's only a few Toqua here who remember. And I'll use them when I can. But otherwise, I got to go out. I got to use Google, right. And I told you the Google story. We can end with this one, maybe.
Please.
Right? Because we're at the 90-minute mark. And I have a call coming up. But, and this is one of those stories that I share with you and this particular audience that usually you shouldn't talk about. But I did go on an ombleche, a vision quest, when I prepared for a Sundance, when I was living in altitude in cool weather in Idaho. And of course, my Sundance was on Pine Ridge, and it was going to be 114 degrees. And I told my wife, I'm not acclimated now. I'm not living there anymore. I don't think I can tolerate 4 days without water. She said, well, you better go pray on it. So I went up on the hill. And the first thing I did, I was still in my Western mindset, and I had my tobacco ties that I had done and set them in a circle. Got in with my chanupa. Right away, a rat, in like a minute of silence, a rat comes in, starts eating on the tobacco of one of the ties, and I kicked it away. I can't believe that I kicked it away. Come on, God, that could have been the vision.
Right.
The messenger. So I sat there feeling, well, now I'm going to be up here for a long time for nothing, right? That kind of thing, right? But I got back into my energy in that mindset of meditation. I came back. And I go, okay, thank you, and started eating again. And then it stopped eating, and it took a step inside the center, just in front of my knee, and faced the west direction that I was facing, like a pet mascot. And now I knew that this was why I had come up to deal with this problem of the heat and no water. And so at the end of my quest, I went down, made the fire for the Inipi ceremony, and what did I do? I'm in Idaho. I don't have any knowledge of elders here that have the wisdom. I'm at 5,000 feet, near Sun Valley. I didn't know what to do. What is this? What kind of animal was this? What does it mean? So I go to Google. I'm on Google and I'm putting in mammals of North America. And there it is. And I can't remember the Latin name. I should remember it. But it was called the kangaroo rat. And it had a picture of it with this big back legs and a long tail. Exactly the animal that was in the circle. And it said, the first sentence, the kangaroo rat is the only mammal in North America that can go a lifetime without a drop of water.
Wow.
Now, so that's all it took for my confidence and everything, right? And I was using Google, right? And so, we got to support sovereignty and the remaining cultures as best we can. So they're a lot closer to this, right? And, I'm a maid relative of the Oglala Lakota, and one of the 7 sacred ceremonies is the making of a relative ceremony. I have storified stories that I grew up with my 5 aunts about a 16 or 15-year-old girl that escaped from the Trail of Tears in Joplin, Missouri, and from the Cherokee, and was made a relative of the family and all that. But it's like, it doesn't matter who we are. You don't have to. This identity thing has become and originally was a tool of divide and conquer, right? And so this is why Fool's Crow's statement is so important. And it's like folks like yourself who are doing this kind of work, you're gonna always find somebody that's against it, right? Doesn't matter. I told you the story about the 2 medicine men that came up to me when I played a song afterwards, right? After playing music for raising money for Mark Sorensen's Star School, and one medicine man said, better than to bring that song out of the circle, and I patted him on the shoulder and said, brother, we agree to disagree on that. And then a minute later, another highly respected medicine man hugged me and said, thanks for bringing it out of the circle. We got to realize that Indian country and everybody else is divided. We got to do what's right. And the worldview belongs to all creatures, and there's nobody that owns it. And I'm starting to refer to it now as pre-colonial as opposed to indigenous, so people don't think it belongs to a race or anything. I'm starting to do that more and more, but it doesn't matter. I still want to call it indigenous because of the remaining cultures that we've got to survive. So, Ake Wasian Kinkte, Metako Yasin, thank you so much for your work in the world, for your writing, your work, and this amazing interview. And please let me know when it's available. I'd love to share this with people because your questions were, if all the interviews that I've done in the last couple of years, over 100, if I was going to say, I want you to ask these questions because these are the things that need to be answered. Wow, you nailed it.
Well, I thank you for leading me. I'm just curious. And like I told you, when I emailed you last year out of the blue, just a cold email, I never thought that you would respond. I truly didn't. You don't owe me a response. You didn't owe me a response then, but you changed my life. And so I'm sorry that it took us a year to come back together, but I'm glad that our coming back together meant something.
All right, let's stay well.
Yes, sir. Stick around for 1 second. Let it upload.
All right.
I'll stop recording.